Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Podcast Host Revealed. I'm Andrew Menczel. Friends and enemies call me Menners. I'm joined by James O'Loughlin, who is an author, comedian, media personality. But I've got him on this podcast because he's the host of Minding Your Mind with Professor Ian Hickie. James, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Thank you, Menners. I'm fantastic.
Just full disclosure, James and I have known each other for a very, very long time. He actually met his wife at my family home, Lucy.
Yes.
So you've got me to thank, or you got my brother to thank or be angry at, however you want to go with that.
I'm very grateful to Stephen.
That's my
and of
older
course,
brother.
our daughters used to play in the same netball team.
Exactly. So James and I have known each other for a while, but great that he could come on and talk about what was a very successful podcast last year. It was nominated for Best Wellbeing Podcast at the 2021 Australian Podcast Awards, and we all need a bit of wellbeing, don't we, at the moment, James?
Yeah, well, we do. It was in retrospect, we launched the podcast in, I think, June of last year. It was a good time to launch it really accidentally, because that was about when we all went back into lockdown again and kind of we talked about a lot of mental health issues that can arise with lockdown and with anxiety with COVID, and about trusting various sources of information. So it was, probably a time when a lot of people were thinking more about mental health and wellbeing than they do normally.
And also you had a lot of time at home to record podcasts as well.
Yeah,
so practical.
True. That's true. And people had a lot of time, hopefully, to listen to them.
Exactly. So I guess, how would you describe your podcast?
It's about all aspects of mental health. So my co-host, Professor Ian Hickie, is a psychiatrist and the head of the Brain and Mind Centre at Sydney University, and one of the foremost kind of advocates and experts on mental health in Australia. And each week, and I'm the guy who asks him questions, basically. Each week we pick a topic, and it might be something that is a well-known mental health issue like anxiety or depression or eating disorders or OCD, but it might be kind of anything wider, anything to do with how our brain works. So we've done episodes on who do we trust and why. We've done episodes on anger. We've done episodes on what do we inherit and what don't we inherit. We all know that, I know I've got my dad's big nose, but am I likely to have my dad or my mum's temperament? And if so, to what extent, and how will that interact with the environment? We've kind of done episodes on what self-help strategies actually help and which don't. So it's it goes from those core mental health things into basically anything about our brain and our mind.
I noticed today's episode, as we record, this is on love, so got that to listen to later on.
Yes, what is love?
Good. Looking forward to you giving me the answer, and you and Ian. So I better, by the time I go to bed tonight, know exactly how love works.
Exactly.
So why then did you start the show? What was the motivation to work with Professor Ian Hickie and put this podcast out there?
So when I used to host shows on ABC Radio, I had Ian on as a regular guest, and I think we had him on once because of something that popped up in the news, and this would have been in the early 2000s, and thought, wow, this guy's seems to know everything about mental health, and B, is a really good communicator. He's great at chatting, and listeners like listening to him and ringing in and asking him questions. So, and I've always been interested in mental health myself, in how my brain works and how I can kind of figure out my relationship with the world and deal with stress and enjoy, what life has to offer without letting the difficulties that life presents overwhelm me. So that's kind of, in a way, what mental health is and why I was primarily interested. So I started doing a regular thing with him every few weeks, and did that, when I was working on ABC Radio. And then we happened to be on holidays at the same place accidentally up the Central Coast, maybe about a year ago now. And I said, I reckon, and I wasn't working for ABC Radio anymore, I reckon we should do a podcast. It'd be interesting, it'd be fun. I'm still really interested in mental health, and you obviously want to get mental health messages out there and educate people. And he said, yeah, that's a good idea. And I thought, oh yeah, right. And then, he was quite keen on it. We got it happening and started recording them and then started chucking them out into the world.
Has it turned out as you'd planned?
I guess so, insofar as we planned it. I mean, the good thing about our thing was that we knew we communicated well together. We'd had a lot of time doing that on radio, and I knew how he worked and he knew how I worked. And we can't, I mean, I would say to him when we were doing stuff on radio, oh, can we do something tonight on, trust or something? And he'd just text back, yes. And I would kind of know that he wouldn't have much time to think about it before he got to studio. But I would, and sometimes he'd come in and go, what are we talking about again? And then he would be incredibly articulate and insightful and, as if he'd just read up on the very latest research. So, I knew we had a good chemistry and got each other, and that he had all the knowledge and I was quite curious, and that was probably a pretty good template, and we've just kind of stuck to that, really. And people are suggesting topics. You should do something on this and you should do something on that. You should do one on self-esteem. What is that? Where does it come from? How do you build it if you haven't got good self-esteem? You should do one on love. What does it really mean? Is it this romantic obsessional thing that's actually very close to, has some of the attributes in common with mental illness, or is it actually wanting someone someone you care about? Is it caring about their needs more than your own? So yeah, there's no shortage of topics.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's plenty of episodes there. So, I speak to a lot of podcasters who sort of maybe haven't done broadcasting professionally like you have, and they start podcasting, and, obviously there's a lot of, upskilling as they get into it, but you're sort of coming, I guess, from a different, path. You've experienced broadcast and plenty of TV and radio, but I'm curious, how you will sort of approach podcasting. Is there any difference to, how you've approached the other mediums?
Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, I think I worked on ABC Radio for 15 years. And so in that period, you learn how to talk, and you learn things like energy and keeping the interest, trying to keep the listener interested and asking questions they might want to know the answer to. One of the great things is that on ABC Radio, probably most radio, they drill into you to keep forward promoting, keep doing time calls, keep ensuring that the listener knows where they are. So, every 5 or 10 minutes, you're supposed to say, by the way, I'm talking to Menczel, and we're on Podcast Host Revealed, and it's whatever time it is. And after we finish with Menczel, we've got the sport report coming up after the news and all that sort of stuff. And it's really, really, really good not having to do any of that. So to get rid of all the housekeeping and just pick a topic and discuss it. And also you can go a bit longer and into more depth than you can on radio. I think you don't do many radio stories that go for 40 minutes, which is, 30 to 40 minutes appears to be kind of the average for this sort of podcast. So it's kind of freer, I guess, maybe a bit less unpredictable, because you don't have listeners calling in, or you don't have an emergency, bushfire you've got to quickly cross to and all that sort of stuff. But there's a greater sense of, this is my lane, mental health. This is what we're talking about. We're going to stick on this. Everything we say has to kind of be related to that, because that's what we're about.
And also, I guess the audience is coming for that, which is great. You're not trying to, speak to a broader audience. It's people who want to hear about this material and happy for you to sort of go deep and go off on tangents. And I love that about my cricket podcast. You know that people are coming with an assumed knowledge, and you can sort of start there, which I think is just quite enjoyable. What about the weight of responsibility? I mean, when I'm talking about cricket, who should open the batting, it's not nearly as important as some of the mental health issues that you deal with. I mean, have you felt any sense of responsibility about the way you tackle them?
Well, fortunately, Ian, is, as I said, one of the country's foremost experts, and he's got decades of experience. And I mean, actually, it's funny you should say that, because last time we recorded, we had a slight disagreement over something, and he was saying, well, it's like this. And I said, well, I reckon it's a bit like that. And then I quickly added the disclaimer, by the way, one of the two people talking is a mental health expert, qualified psychiatrist with 30 years of experience, and the other is me. So, I think there is certainly a different weighting to the views that they should give. But there's obviously a responsibility about mental health, and we did an episode on people who are experiencing suicidal thoughts. And of course, when you're going into that sort of ground, there's a great responsibility. But I always remember my role. My role is to ask questions. My role is to be curious. My role is to, whenever Ian says something that sounds vaguely technical or medical, to go, hang on, what does that mean? Can you just tell, use normal language? So it's his responsibility, and he knows. I mean, he's got more responsibility than me in that respect, and he knows how to exercise that.
Absolutely. I imagine, you connect with the audience on quite a deep level. When you go into topics like this, you are, talking to people's, I guess, a lot of their innermost fears, a lot of things that they keep quite personal. How's the reaction been? I guess maybe starting with family or friends, have they listened to the show, and then do they come up to you and want to talk about their problems?
Look, I have sent out like we usually operate about a month ahead in terms of recording to release. But a number of times we've had episodes that are relevant that, I've sent to friends and said, like, for example, last year we did something on big life crises, and at the time a friend of mine was dying, and I actually steered the conversation more to toward that sort of crisis, grief and dying, rather than losing your job or losing a relationship, although we did touch on those. But I sent it out to, other friends and said, look, there's some really good stuff in here about how you deal with this stuff, and have a listen. So it has prompted some really interesting discussions with people. And I think it's part of hopefully a wider movement in society for people to, no one feels anxious or weird saying, I've got a sore knee. We're allowed to talk about our physical health. And 20 years ago, there was a great deal of shame and kind of embarrassment in talking about mental health. And there still is to an extent, but I feel that's changing quite rapidly. It does feel more personal, more like, there's something, if you've got a sore knee, it feels like there's something wrong with your knee. If you're experiencing a mental health difficulty, it feels like there's something wrong with you, even though the causes might be quite kind of chemical and not really. So it is more personal and harder to talk about, but certainly I've had lots of really good conversations with people over the past year. People have emailed us, listeners have emailed us with some quite personal things. And I think anything that promotes that, our society and people to be more open, talking about their mental health in any way is a good thing. What's the classic Australian conversation? How are you going? Good. Well, often that's not true. Often we start conversations with a lie.
Yeah, but I think that's good for the other person.
Yeah,
no one wants to hear all my problems when I run into them at the school playground. So with, you said you got correspondence from listeners. I can imagine a lot of people are compelled to reach out because you connect with them on quite a deep level. I guess how in your, sort of comparing your other mediums, how does the sort of connection between the podcaster and the audience feel to you?
Oh, it's really interesting because radio is so direct. Radio is so, like, people ring in real time, people text in real time. And I used to do a long time ago, the evening radio show on ABC from 7 p.m. till 10 p.m. for 6 years. And I remember my last show, I felt like I was saying goodbye to people I really knew. And I found myself saying, I really miss you. Thank you so much for your contributions over the years. And, a lot of the content has come from you listeners and individual listeners like, Chris, it's been great to get to know you over the years. Thanks a lot. And I'd never met them, but we talked a lot on the phone. So it's not as direct as that, is it? And I think when you start,
and you get the real time with the radio as well, that it's live and happening.
Yeah. And I think anyone who starts a podcast, I mean, anyone who starts anything really thinks, is anyone going to care? Is anyone going to listen? And it's quite scary. And when you do build up a listenership, I mean, the thing about ABC Radio is that people listen because it's ABC Radio. Like some people liked me, some people hated me, but they still listened because it was ABC Radio and they were damn well going to listen to ABC local radio. With podcasts that every single listener is making a pretty big commitment. Like there's tens of thousands of podcasts.
Millions.
Yeah. And they've picked yours. And it's quite like, if you have 3 listeners, that's kind of great that 3 people are prioritizing what you're saying over all those millions. So it's kind of a different relationship, but you appreciate each listener more, I think.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think the fact that podcasting, people choose to listen to you, as you say, and if people stick with you for a while, then they do build up a sort of close bond. So it's a very powerful medium. What sort of, have you received any criticism for the podcast? Has anyone got in touch and thought you did a bad job on a topic or not happy with something you've said?
Not really. Like Ian's pretty great. The only one was, I did a whole episode we were talking about in January 2022 how the risk assessment from COVID had shifted from the government to individuals. So last year with lockdown, they made the rules, and then government said, okay, we're not doing lockdowns anymore. It's up to each of you to do your own risk assessment on whether you want to go to the pub, on basically everything. When you want to go to the movies, it's on you now, not on us. And we did an episode on how confronting that is and how we can go through the process of doing risk assessments 8 times a day, basically. But anyway, I called.
You got a response.
Well, actually, the only criticism we got is I spent the whole episode calling Omicron. And someone picked me up on that and said, I typed Omicron into Google and I couldn't even get a response. And so it was only a kind of a grammatical thing. As you can imagine, I used to get a lot of them on ABC Radio too. I can't say the word nuclear. See, I still can't say it. Yeah, like nuclear war. And when I just can't say it, I don't know why, but whenever we had to do a story on that, I go, oh no. And as soon as I said the word for the first time, I just see the switchboard light up with listeners telling me what an idiot I was. So yeah, we haven't had.
You don't get that in podcasting. You don't get the switchboard lighting up when you mispronounce a word.
Yeah. And look, I suspect with podcasts, people don't so much write to criticize, they just stop listening. Whereas on ABC Radio, they own it. So they feel more of a sense that this isn't right. I own this and I want to tell this person they're doing it badly or whatever.
Yeah, I'm used to that in many mediums, especially cricket commentary. Anything, I guess, you're looking back, I heard your sort of wrap up of 2021 where you and Professor sort of looked back on some of your favorite episodes. If you sort of look back and thought there's some episodes, I don't know, you didn't quite nail, or you just want to go back and maybe expand on those topics?
Well, interestingly, we're doing a book at the moment, a spin-off from the podcast that'll be out by the end of 2022. And as part of that process, I'm reading all the transcripts. And what is kind of fascinating is how differently we speak to how like you read the transcript and it's very easy to think, well, there's some nuggets in there, but there's also a lot of just kind of gobbledygook that doesn't translate at all into the written word. But when you listen to it, it kind of sounds normal-ish. So I suppose when I look at it now, when I'm writing the chapters for our book, I'm looking at it in a very structural way and thinking, well, actually, when we did that episode, we started here and then we went to something else, but then we came back to that first point and we should have really stuck to the first point. And then, but conversation's different, isn't it? And it's less structured and kind of more repetitive. Like if you read something once and then you read the same sentence again, you'd think, yeah, I've just read that. Don't tell me twice. But often in conversation, we do repeat things that are important because that's how we emphasize they're important, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's why I think the sort of difference between, say, a podcast and a talk. Ian could write down a talk and just come and deliver it all, but it wouldn't be a conversation. You're right; there'd be no repetition. It'd sort of maybe look like it flows better on paper, but it's not that sort of multi-dimensional.
Yeah. But I think the idea of, like, we always have a structure for our conversations, but I guess one of the tricky things, I think, is trying to get the right mix in a podcast between, working out and structuring what you're going to do, and also being open and conversational and free to kind of, oh, we've started talking about that was going to come later, so let's go with that, but still keeping it so it's feels organized for the listener. Do you know what I mean? Do you guys?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
That?
So the way I approach that is I have, a structure and what I think is the sort of flow. But if you get into a conversation that goes off, that's great. And you should go with it. But then you've got the structure to pull you back. You can sort of
and I always
rein it
find,
back at some point.
Like, our basic structure is, if we're talking about anxiety, what is it? Why does it happen? What do we do about it? That's kind of something anger. What is it? Why does it happen? What do we do about it? I.e., how do we control it? And so it's really easy to start talking about the what do you do about it earlier, like how do we control anger? And that's kind of coming up in the first 5 minutes. Then there's always a question, isn't there? We say, well, let's just go with that. Or you say, okay, we're going to talk about that in a minute, but firstly, let's just sort out what it is. So you kind of, sometimes you feel like you get those decisions right, and sometimes you feel like you get them wrong. Well, I do anyway.
I mean, imagine with the Professor Ian Hickie that, because he's so smart, part of the challenge for you is just reining him back sometimes and, keeping him on some kind of path that the not so intelligent listener will be able to follow.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I feel that I could walk into the studio and say, so Ian, tell us about anger, and then leave, go and get a sandwich, come back 50 minutes later.
Still going.
Thanks for joining us. See you later. And he would have given, he would have done pretty well. He would have given listeners some great info. But yes, I think I do try and provide that sense of structure and discipline. And whoa, stop talking about that. We've got to finish talking about this first. I try and do that without kind of interfering with the vibe, if you know what I mean.
And then you don't have to tell the time and the weather and what segment's coming next, which is nice. So, I mean, this is a sort of you can sort of open up as much as you want on this one, but, I'm always interested in the way the content affects the host. And, you mentioned, your interest in your own mental health. I mean, how has, undertaking this podcast helped your mental health? Did you have problems that everyone has problems, but did you have something, that you wanted to sort of find out more, and, how was doing it helped that or informed that?
Look, I've always been interested in mental health and have had episodes of quite intense anxiety since about the mid-90s, maybe 3 or 4 of them in that 25-year period, but each one, lasting some months with strong, repetitive, obsessional, worrying thoughts. They're always essentially, now I look back at them, about things that were never going to happen. But that's what irrational anxiety is. Like, rational anxiety is worrying about things that do have a decent chance of happening. Irrational anxiety is worrying about either things that don't have much of a chance of happening, or things that, they might happen, but it's not really going to be that big a deal. So I had 3 or 4 episodes of them over. So I've always been particularly interested in anxiety. And interestingly enough, and I always felt I was quite privileged being on the radio, because I could do a thing that you can justify as a story on the radio, like, oh, we wanted to do talk to an expert about anxiety on a radio because it's pretty common, it's pretty interesting. But secretly, I'd also be doing it to, for me to find out more about it as well. That's not I got kind of treatment as well. I didn't just kind of use the radio as my only source.
You're not endorsing just listening to a podcast if you need treatment. That's right.
But it is a great way to find out more about things. But interestingly, so we did an episode on anxiety, and I've been pretty good for a while now. Although you never know, like, if you've got a vulnerability to something, it can flare up. But it was only really not even doing the episode with Ian, but turning the episode on anxiety into a book chapter where I really got something that I hadn't got even after reading books and books and having therapy about anxiety, in that it's not just about your thoughts, it's about what he calls your level of arousal. That is, when you get anxious about something, it's not just, I'm worried that, I don't know, I'm going to get cancer, right? It's there's a physiological response where your heartbeat quickens, your breathing shallow, similar to being nervous, and you feel just off. You feel, and you actually, to control anxiety, it's not just about pushing back at those thoughts. I'm going to get cancer, can't do anything about it. Most people with cancer survive. I'm going to die sometime anyway, rationally combating them. That's not going to work unless you can get your physiology down and actually experience the worrying thoughts while learning how to lower your level of arousal. So I guess that's something that that's kind of quite a basic thing. But because I'm a head person, I think things, I like to think my way through problems. Or through all these anxiety episodes I've had, I've totally kind of undervalued and missed that. And so only really through the podcast has that finally sunk in.
Breathe. Nice, slow
Exactly.
breathing.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally get that. What about some of your favorite episodes, some of your favorite guests? You mentioned, I think, Greg Pickhaver from
He
Roy and
was great.
HG.
Yeah.
I did notice, though, it took you a while to get him to open up a bit. I sort of thought that the first half of the interview, he was a bit nervous because it is hard. I mean, if you asked me on your show to talk about my mental health, I would be a bit sort of nervous with that until you sort of get into it.
Yeah, you're right. And we had Greg on the episodes about mental health and humor and the role of humor in kind of preserving your mental health. And it's hard to be depressed and laugh at the same time. So if you can laugh, it's a good thing if you're depressed, for example. But you're right in that, there is a reasonably fine line between Greg, the person, and HG, the character. And in fact, Greg said to me before we started, he said, look, I'm going to go in and out of HG. Some I'm going to answer as HG, some I'll answer as Greg. And, you can try and stop me doing that if you like, and whatever, you can ask me the question again and say, but this time answer as Greg. So yeah, I think that's a very fair point you make. And, but yeah, I think towards the end we did get some more kind of Greggish things and his own. I mean, one of the really interesting things I remember him saying was, humor can often go over the line and become close to bullying. Like, we've probably all been in groups. They're often groups of young blokes, aren't they, where there's teasing, but then you can see someone's pushing at someone and it's hurting them. And, they're using humor, but it's not being humor that makes everyone feel better. It's humor at someone. And, I was asking him about that and he said, oh yeah, I've got a rule about that. And I said, what is he? He said, I go home. If anyone's doing that to me, I just leave. And I thought, that's a really sensible strategy, isn't it? Because often we think we have to be part of the group. We have to show we're tough. We have to be, good, okay with it. But he said, no, I don't want to be I don't want to be the butt of anyone using jokes to bully me. I'll just leave. So I thought that was great. The other
that jumped out to me as well, that bit, and I thought actually it's really good advice if you're in a situation like that. Just go and then go home, have a cup of tea, and you feel a lot better.
And then actually the other thing that does is everyone reflects and they think, oh, why did he leave? Oh, was it because of that? Oh, right. And maybe, hopefully they get the message. The other guest I thought who was very brave was Malcolm Turnbull, who came on and spoke about the deep depression that he suffered after he lost the Liberal leadership the first time in, I think it was beginning of 2008. He was rolled by Tony Abbott. It was all about climate change and he fell into a huge depression. He thought about leaving politics and he opened up in a very clear way about that. And I thought the most interesting part of his story was, we said to him, but you went, so what triggered your depression was being the leader of your party and getting rolled. You then went back into politics. You became the leader of the party again and you got rolled again. But this time while you were prime minister, you must have been terrified that was going to trigger it all again. And he said, well, I was to an extent. I think I'm paraphrasing. I think this is what he said, but I had made changes to my life that fortified me. So exercise,
Kayaking, I remember that. I listened to that,
kayaking and
walking around rocks in Rose Bay, never been before. That's adventurous.
yeah, exactly.
No, there's some cynicism in that.
That's right. Well, they
living on the edge, Mal, finding some new rocks. Get out there. But I guess, for those listening who are curious about the show, so the structure is it's you and Professor Ian Hickie sometimes just talking through issues, and then other times we'll bring in a guest who might add to an issue, as you say, humor and mental health. I probably got more out of the episodes with just you and the professor. I just found they flowed a bit better for me. But I mean, as I said, I listened to the term.
I get that, because I mean, Ian has got such a lot to say, and he's such a talkative chappy that 3 can feel a bit, sometimes a bit busy. And kind of the way we've done it is me ask the questions, the guest comment, tell their story, and then Ian kind of add his wisdom, 2 cents worth as expertise. But I do agree that it can sometimes feel a bit crowded.
Yeah, but a terrific show. I end all these podcast host revealed interviews, James, with, what's your favorite memory related to this podcast?
Oh, that's very good. That's very good.
It is good because, I love podcasting. It's changed my life. I have lucky to have probably 100 favorite memories now. But, I'm curious what yours is as someone who's been in broadcasting for a long time.
Look, I love spending time with Ian, and also our producer, Rod, who's a lovely guy. And it was funny. One of my kids was asking me the other day about Ian and said, oh, you probably talked about that with Ian, but, probably not in the podcast personally. And then I stopped and said, actually, you know what? Most of the personal conversations, the kind of intimate conversations Ian and I have been on the podcast. That's when, I kind of open up more, and maybe he does to an extent too. And it is kind of like growing this friendship where we're talking about a common interest, although, our interest comes from very different places. His is expertise and me as something, a layperson being curious. But with, it's probably the same with cricket. It's because mental health, you have to go right into how you think and how you feel and whatever. But I think it's the same with cricket or a gardening podcast. By talking about a common interest with people, you actually really get to know people in more of a way that you do sometimes than if you're just going through chit chat at a party. Do you know what I mean?
No, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you can, we wouldn't talk about like this in a playground. Podcasting is a sort of intimate medium. But look, that's a great memory, and I think a beautiful basis for a podcast, that there's that genuine relationship between you and Professor, and you can, take that to the podcast and, share it with the world. And congratulations, it's been a wonderful show. I've got a lot of value out of the episodes I listen to, and I'm sure, other people will get the same. So thank you very much, and congratulations.
Oh, thanks so much, Menczel, and really appreciate you saying that as a podcast aficionado.
Well, excellent. Well, that was James O'Loughlin from Minding Your Mind, and this has been Podcast Host Revealed.